Welcome to our deep dive into the world of Karl Leonhard Reinhold.
Yeah.
You might not know his name, but he was a big deal in German idealism, like a philosophical Indiana Jones,
Uh-huh.
unearthing some hidden gems of thought. He could make even the most complex ideas understandable.
Oh, you're so right. Reinhold doesn't always get the spotlight, but his work is like a bridge between Kant and those giants of German idealism, Fichte and Hegel. He was tackling some really fundamental questions about knowledge and consciousness, stuff that's still puzzling philosophers today.
Right. So first things first, Reinhold started out as a Catholic priest, but then he switched over to Protestantism and became a huge champion of Enlightenment values. Kind of a wild turn of events, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, definitely. And that shift actually gets at something really important about Reinhold's thinking. For him, philosophy wasn't just some abstract thing. He thought it could actually make the world a better place, improve society and people themselves.
He wanted to make philosophy relevant for everyday life. Like he actually thought these big abstract ideas could have real impact in the world.
Absolutely. And that's exactly what made him such a great popularizer of Kant. Kant's stuff was notoriously dense. But Reinhold translated those complex ideas into a language that more people could understand. He was crucial in spreading Kantian philosophy and setting the stage for the whole German idealism movement.
Like a philosophical translator,
You're right.
bridging the gap between, the ivory tower and the public square.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's get into Reinhold's own ideas, his elementary philosophy. He had this goal of creating a truly scientific philosophy,
Yeah.
like finding that bedrock foundation for everything else.
Exactly. He wanted to find that one unshakable principle, that first principle, that everything else could be built upon. That had to be self-evident and totally irrefutable. And that's where his famous principle of consciousness comes in. Ready for this? It goes like this. In consciousness, the subject distinguishes the representation from the subject and the object and relates the representation to both.
Whoa, okay, yeah, that's a bit of a mouthful. What's he really trying to say with this principle?
Well, he's trying to get at the most basic structure of our experience. He's saying that whenever we're conscious of something, there are three parts. There's the subject, that's us, the one experiencing. There's the object, the thing we're experiencing. And then there's the representation, the way that object shows up in our minds.
So it's not just defining these terms, it's about how they all work together when we experience the world.
Right. It's a synthetic principle, not just a definition, but a description of what's actually happening in our consciousness. Reinhold's saying our minds aren't just passively absorbing information, they're actively creating our experience by connecting subject, object, and representation.
So this principle of consciousness, that's his cornerstone, right? That's the foundation for his whole philosophical system. Like he's saying, if we can understand this basic act of consciousness, then we can unlock all the other mysteries about knowledge and reality.
And he really went for it. He tried to use this principle to figure out all these other Kantian concepts like space-time and the categories of understanding. It's an incredibly ambitious project.
Like building a huge philosophical cathedral brick by brick, starting with that one foundational principle. Did it work? Did he manage to create that big unified system?
Well, that's where things get even more interesting. It was groundbreaking and really influential, but not everyone was convinced. Some philosophers started pointing out problems like cracks in the foundation, questioning whether those derived concepts were really connected to his principle of consciousness.
So even the most well-built philosophical systems can have weaknesses. It's like finding a structural flaw in that perfect cathedral. How did Reinhold respond to those criticisms? Did he just stick to his guns with his elementary philosophy, or did he change course?
Well, that's what we'll get into next. Reinhold's response to those criticisms shows how intellectually honest he was and how willing he was to keep refining his thinking. He didn't cling to his initial system. Instead, he went on a really fascinating intellectual journey, exploring different philosophical views and pushing the limits of his own understanding.
That's when things get really interesting. He didn't see those criticisms as a setback, He used them to explore further. He's like a philosophical Indiana Jones, always on the hunt for deeper truths, even if it means going into uncharted territory. So where does his journey take him next? Who are the other thinkers that caught his attention and shaped his views?
That's a story for our next segment, but let me just say, this Reinhold's journey takes him through some of the most fertile intellectual landscapes of his time, and his encounters with other brilliant minds lead to some real surprises. Get ready, because we're diving even deeper into the fascinating world of Karl Leonhard Reinhold.
All right, so we left off with Reinhold facing some pretty tough criticism about his elementary philosophy, especially about how he derived other concepts from his principle of consciousness. And you mentioned he didn't just dig in his heels, but that he really took on the challenge. So what happened next?
You got it. He was super open to new ideas. And one of the first people that really caught his eye was Johann Gottlieb Fichte, another big name in German idealism.
Ah, Fichte. Yeah, he had his own kind of idealism, right?
Right.
So what was it about Fichte's work that drew Reinhold in?
Well, Fichte had this really dynamic and you could even say radical way of thinking about the I, the self,
Yeah.
the subject. Kant saw the I as kind of this static observer of the world. But Fichte argued that the I is always creating itself through its actions, through its engagement with the world.
So it's not just passively observing, it's actively shaping reality just by existing.
Yeah, exactly. And this idea of the self-positing I really grabbed Reinhold's attention. He started to see the limits of his own system, which relied on a more static understanding of the subject. Maybe consciousness wasn't just about relating subject, object, and representation. Maybe it was about this dynamic process of the I constantly creating and recreating itself.
It's like he's moving from a snapshot to a film. The I is the director, the writer, and the star all in one.
I like that analogy. And this whole fascination with Fichte really changed how Reinhold thought. He started to explore this idea of the I as the ultimate ground of knowledge and reality.
But wait a minute, there's more to the story. It's not just a two-man show between Reinhold and Fichte. There's another guy who enters the scene, Karl Gottlieb Bardili, and his rational realism. So tell us about him and how he fits into Reinhold's journey.
Okay, so Bardili, this is where things take another fascinating turn. He was all about what some people call immanent realism, the idea that reality is actually made up of thought itself.
So instead of the mind just reflecting in external reality, Bardili saying the mind or thought actually creates reality.
That's the main idea. And he was especially interested in thinking qua thinking, understanding thought in its purest form, not connected to the outside world or even a thinking subject.
Okay, now we're getting into some pretty deep stuff. Thinking qua thinking. It's like trying to grasp the very essence of thought without all the usual baggage. How did Reinhold react to this?
Well, remember, he was already captivated by Fichte's dynamic I. Bardili's focus on pure thought just added another layer to it. It suggested that maybe there's this realm of pure thought before anything else, before even the self-positing I.
So he's peeling back the layers of the onion, going even deeper than the individual I to find the ultimate source of thought and reality.
Exactly. And while Reinhold didn't completely buy into Bardili's whole system, he was definitely interested in this idea of pure thought. It kind of planted the seed for his later work on the philosophy of language.
So we're seeing Reinhold go through these different phases. First, he's grounding philosophy in this fixed principle of consciousness. Then he's exploring the dynamic I with Fichte. And now he's diving into this world of pure thought with Bardili. He's constantly searching, refining, and pushing his thinking further.
That's a great observation. And all of this leads him to what many consider his most important contribution to philosophy, his linguistic turn.
Okay, so this is where it gets real. This linguistic turn, this is where Reinhold's ideas start to foreshadow some of the big movements in 20th century philosophy. So what exactly is this linguistic turn? How did he come to see language as so central to philosophy?
Well, it's kind of the culmination of all those earlier explorations. He begins to realize that language isn't just a tool for expressing our thoughts. It's totally intertwined with the way we think. He argues that the way language is structured actually shapes our understanding of reality, and that a lot of philosophical problems come from ambiguities and inconsistencies in language itself.
So language is both how we think and the potential source of philosophical confusion.
That's it. And this realization leads Reinhold to this really ambitious project, creating a system of synonymic.
Synonymic, that's not a word you hear every day. What was he trying to do with that?
Basically, he imagined a super precise language, a language where every word only had one clear meaning. He thought that by getting rid of all the ambiguities in natural language, we could solve philosophical disagreements and understand reality better.
Like he's trying to create a philosophical Esperanto, a universal language of thought, to go beyond the limits of how we normally speak and think.
It's a great comparison. And this project, even though it wasn't really finished, represents a huge shift in the history of philosophy. Reinhold was one of the first to see how important language is in shaping our understanding of the world.
It's like he's setting the stage for thinkers like Wittgenstein and Frege, who would also wrestle with the connections between language, thought, and reality. But even with those insights, I bet Reinhold's synonymic project wasn't without its problems. What were some of the challenges in trying to create this perfect language?
Well, the biggest challenge is probably just how complex language is. Natural languages are always changing, adapting to new situations, expressing all sorts of human experiences. Trying to pin down one fixed meaning for every word, that's a pretty tough job.
It's like trying to capture a river in a photograph. You can get a glimpse, but you miss the movement, the constant change.
Right. And then there's the question of how do you justify those fixed meanings? Who decides what a word really means? Reinhold doesn't really give us a method for finding those absolute definitions.
So it's kind of like saying you're the ultimate dictionary maker without explaining how you came up with your definitions.
Exactly. And then there's this deeper philosophical question. Could a perfectly precise language actually capture the richness and complexity of human thought and experience? Even if you get rid of all the ambiguity, wouldn't you also lose some of the nuance and the creative possibilities of language?
That's interesting. It's like asking if a perfectly logical world would also be an interesting world. Would we give up some of the beauty and depth of expression for absolute clarity?
That's a question Reinhold leaves for us to think about. But even if his synonymic project never really came to fruition, it shows how ambitious he was and how much he understood the importance of language for philosophy.
So while Reinhold might not have created that ultimate philosophical language, he definitely opened up a new way of looking at things, a new way of understanding how our words, our thoughts, and the world around us are all connected. It's like he gave us this new toolbox filled with concepts and methods to explore these fundamental questions.
Absolutely, and I think that's his lasting legacy. He might not have built that perfect philosophical system, but he gave us all these tools and new perspectives to understand the power and limitations of language, thought, and knowledge.
It's a legacy that continues to inspire and challenge philosophers today. Speaking of challenges, I'm curious to hear more about the critiques of Reinhold's overall approach. We've talked about some specific issues, but what were some of the bigger objections people had?
Well, one of the main criticisms is about his reliance on a single first principle, whether it's the principle of consciousness or later the idea of pure thought. Critics said it was too reductive, like trying to force the entire complexity of human experience into one neat little framework.
Like trying to fit the ocean into a teacup.
Yeah.
You might capture a little drop, but you miss the vastness, the depth, the way everything's connected.
Yeah, exactly. And some people question whether Reinhold really managed to derive all those other concepts from his first principle. They said there were gaps in his logic, that the connections weren't as clear or as solid as he claimed.
So even though he built this huge, elaborate philosophical structure, some people doubted the strength of the foundation and how well the whole design fit together.
That's a good way of putting it. But even with those criticisms, Reinhold's work is still really important. He pushed the limits of philosophical thinking, he grappled with huge questions about knowledge and reality, and he really set the stage for German idealism and what came after.
He was a pioneer, and his journey shows us that philosophy isn't about getting the right answer. It's about questioning, refining, and expanding how we understand ourselves and the world. It's like he's telling us that the real adventure isn't the destination, it's the journey itself.
Well said. And that's a perfect way to lead into our final segment, where we'll talk about the impact of Reinhold's work and the questions he left us with.
Okay, so we've been through this whole journey with Reinhold, his search for that one big principle, his time with Fichte and Bardelli, and then that big linguistic turn. What's the takeaway? What's his impact on philosophy?
Well, his own philosophical system, maybe it didn't have the staying power he wanted, but his work had this ripple effect. It went way beyond his own time. He was a catalyst for a lot of the important developments in German idealism. He kind of paved the way for guys like Hegel and Schelling.
Like he planted those intellectual seeds that grew into this whole new landscape of philosophical thought.
That's a good way to put it. Reinhold's focus on consciousness, on the I, and the role of language, it really laid the groundwork for some of the biggest philosophical debates of the 19th and 20th centuries.
So even if his philosophical cathedral had some cracks, he gave the blueprints and the building blocks for the philosophers who came after him.
Exactly. And it's not just German idealism. His emphasis on language being so important for thought, it really foreshadowed the linguistic turn in 20th century philosophy. People like Wittgenstein and the whole development of analytic philosophy.
It's pretty amazing to think about how these ideas from the late 1700s would have such a big impact on how we think about philosophy, even today.
It shows how powerful these fundamental questions are, about consciousness, knowledge, and the relationship between language and thought. These are the kinds of questions that still fascinate and challenge philosophers.
So for our listeners who have been on this deep dive with us, what are the big things to take away? What should they be thinking about as they continue their own philosophical journeys?
I think Reinhold is asking us to look at our own relationship with language. How are the words we use shaping how we understand the world, how we see things, even our values? Can we change our language to get more clarity and understanding, or are we stuck with its limitations?
It's like he's asking us to be more aware of the lenses we're using to see the world, the linguistic lenses that shape our thoughts.
And he's also asking us to think about the nature of consciousness itself. Is it passive or is it active? Is it a product of the world or the source of reality? These are questions that get to the core of who we are and how we see ourselves in the universe.
Those are some big questions to think about. But that's what makes a deep dive like this so great. It's not about easy answers. It's about wrestling with these big mysteries and pushing the boundaries of our own philosophical horizons.
Couldn't agree more. And I think Reinhold would be happy to know that his ideas are still sparking conversations and inspiring us to explore the complexities of thought language and reality.
So if someone wants to learn more about Reinhold, where should they start? Any particular works you'd recommend?
If you want something accessible, I'd say check out his letters on the Kantian philosophy. It's a great way to learn about Kant's ideas, but with Reinhold's own take on them.
Perfect. And for the really adventurous, diving into his elementary philosophy could be really rewarding, though it's definitely a challenge.
For sure. Be ready for some serious philosophical brain work.
Well, to wrap things up, I think it's safe to say that Karl Leonhard Reinhold, even though he's not always a household name, was a true philosophical pioneer. His ideas might not have created that perfectly unified system he wanted, but they started a revolution in philosophical thought that's still going on today.
He was a bridge builder, a catalyst for new ways of thinking. And his dedication to finding clarity in philosophy left a mark on the history of thought. And maybe the best way to honor Reinhold is to keep going with that pursuit, to keep asking questions, to keep exploring, and to keep pushing the limits of what we understand.
That's a great way to end it. So until our next deep dive, keep those philosophical fires burning